Anyway, tonight we have the great pleasure and honor to hear our esteemed and wonderful colleague, Wallace Best. And I'm going to read you his coordinates: BA, Washington Bible College, MA, Wheaton College, and PhD at Northwestern. And his book, which has come out recently in 2005, Passionately Human, many of you know it, No Less Divine, Religion and Culture in Black Chicago. Professor Best is now working on a new book on Elder Smith and also involved in a whole lot of other projects. So we're really happy to hear you talk this evening. And then there will be two respondents from students, Terence Keel and Lawrence Summers, who will... Lauren, not Lawrence. He could try to respond, but I don't think he'd be able to respond very well. But anyway, Lauren. And those responses will be followed by plenty of time for us to discuss and talk to each other about it. So thank you very much, Wallace.
Thank you so much. I am so glad to see you all here tonight. I had some images for you, but as life would have it, I couldn't get the images. We couldn't bring up the images, so I'll have to describe very well tonight. I know you have choices. You chose to be here tonight. I'm very, very happy for that. I wrote this article a couple of years ago, and the interesting about having written this article, now people think I know something about gender. I'm always called upon to talk about gender, and perhaps I have learned something about gender as my work is beginning to deal more and more with the issue of gender and religion. And what I will share with you tonight is what I call my first foray into the intersection of religion and gender. And this chapter from this book, Women in Religion in the African Diaspora, actually I got in a little trouble with the title because I think my fellow conveners didn't know that it was a quote. The Spirit of the Holy Ghost is a male spirit. One woman told me, Wallace, you're setting back the feminist studies 50 years or more. But I told her I was quoting, and I'm quoting from a woman I found in the research for my first book named Mrs. Williams, and she was only identified as Mrs. Williams. And her statement is a beginning point for me for this chapter and what I will share with you tonight. So let me read that portion of this chapter to get us started. In October of 1939, Works Progress Administration WPA worker Alvin N. Cannon walked into a storefront church on East 45th Street in Chicago. It was an independent Pentecostal church, the Royal Prayer Band, headed by a woman identified only as Mrs. Williams. Whether that was her choice or the choice of her interviewer is not known. Her husband, whom she did not identify, had died the year before, leaving her the sole pastor of the small congregation. After noting a, quote, few crude paintings of Christ and the crucifixion hanging on the walls, unquote, Cannon made his way to the living quarters at the back of the church. Cannon found that area to be likewise untidy. When Mrs. Williams appeared, a Southern migrant widow of about 60 years old with a kindly, motherly face, Cannon started the interview. What is the thing which distinguishes your church from the Pentecostal and the Church of God? Cannon asked. Mrs. Williams gave a most remarkable answer. Well, the Church of God in Christ says that only men can preach. Women can only do missionary work. Well, in a sense, they are right, because according to the Bible, the Spirit of the Holy Ghost is a male spirit. But when a woman receives that spirit, she is no longer a woman. Then she has the right to perform the duties of a man, like preaching. Until then, she should only do missionary work and teaching work. The Word of God is a he, and women are the flesh of the world. Now, I believe that some people are born with a unity to God. These people are devoted to the work of the Lord. They don't have time to think about sex and things of the world. Well, that quote raises a number of questions for me. But the one question that I continue to deal with, and I deal with in this chapter, is what is at the core of the resistance to black women in positions of ministerial leadership? What's at the core there? Although women have been what womanist scholar Jacqueline Grant has called the backbone of black churches, wielding enormous influence in setting the theological and cultural tone, they have routinely been blocked from full access to ministerial authority in most mainline African American denominations. Fewer than 5% of the ministers among the mainstream have been women. And even among some black denominations that do allow women to preach and have authority in positions of leadership, a culture of resistance persists. Now, this is not merely a matter of conventional interpretations of the scriptural text. We've all heard of 1 Corinthians 14:34, women keep silent in the churches. Rather, this is rooted in culturally inscribed notions of the black woman's body. It has to do with how people think of, objectify the black female body, seeing the black female body as somehow inherently eroticized and hypersexualized. Now, there are so many examples of this. The first one I will mention anecdotally for those of you who are fans of Sex and the City. Some of you may recall this, Lauren is, that the first time they ever showed full nudity was a shower scene where they showed not one but two black women. The first time I had ever seen black women on Sex and the City where they were nude in the shower. Now, more substantively, as an example, I will mention my sister Melody Dorothy Holmes, who is a pastor in Maryland. One day I had the audacity to ask her if she ever preached when she was pregnant. She said, "Oh no, I wouldn't do that. I always sat down when I was pregnant. I did that to honor my husband." Well, this was about the attention her body would draw to sex with her husband and her sexuality generally. I didn't tell her I thought that's what she was really saying, but that's what I thought she was saying. Now, also Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer, although was not an ordained minister but a black female in a ministerial role as a gospel singer, in her early career she was required to, by many black pastors, to don a robe when she sang. They found the movement of her body during her singing as to be inappropriate, meaning sexually evocative. No black male minister would have been required to do this, mind you, despite the erotics inherent to the way black men preach. Now, there are many examples of this also in African American literature. Claude McKay's wonderful novel Home to Harlem is an example. He describes a scene witnessed by Jake, the protagonist of that novel, in a nightclub where girls from the South had presumably come to seduce men. Here's what he said. "A jungle atmosphere pervaded the room, and like shameless wild animals, hungry for raw meat, the females savagely searched the eyes of the male. Jake had concluded that a woman could always go farther than a man in coarseness, depravity, and sheer cupidity." James Baldwin's migration novel, The Amen Corner, is another example in African American literature. That play is a play rather than a novel, is essentially about the incompatibility of Christian ministry with the notion of black womanhood as implicitly connected to the body and sex. The wonderful character Margaret Alexander in the play, the pastor of a small Harlem storefront church, is ousted by her congregation when her estranged husband appears on the scene. They had thought she had been, quote, born holy and was without much nature. Her husband, Luke, is undeniable evidence of her sexuality and the real possibility of sexual desire in her, and it unfits her for spiritual leadership. As one of the few male congregates declares, she ain't nothing but flesh and blood. He later chides her, you ain't no better than the rest of them women. You done sweated and cried in the nighttime too. You like to be doing it again. You ain't as good as men. He had become convinced that Margaret was just like other women, hypersexualized and unable by nature to control her sexual passions. One final example. It's from the film Hallelujah by the producer King Vidor. You must see this if you have an opportunity. It was the first all-black film produced by a major studio. The protagonist, Zeke Johnson, is drawn by his lust during a highly sexualized revival meeting. What revival meeting is not highly sexualized? To have sex with and then elope with Chick. I had a picture of Chick, but there you go. She's the film's female lead. Although the filmmaker makes certain that the viewer understands that Zeke is motivated by his passions, he is equally keen on portraying the sexually loose Chick as Zeke's temptress and chiefly responsible for his fall. And in fact, the image that I had was a drawing of Chick in this very, very lustful pose with many men of the congregation reaching out to her. And there's one woman holding back a major figure. Don't go there, don't go there. So it's actually Chick who is the problem in that film. Now, this inherent carnality of women, black women in particular, as I'd like to argue, is perhaps the chief implication of Mrs. Williams' statement. Women are the flesh of the world. She equates women with the flesh. She equates women with the flesh and men with the spirit. Thus, the title of this talk, Male Spirits and Female Bodies. Now, there are many possible answers to how she formulated this. It could be a reflection of Platonic Christianity or a Platonized view of sexuality. And also could have something to do with the value-laden dichotomies in what Irish Young calls homologous hierarchical logic, male, female, mind, body, reason, passion, public, private. However, primarily it has to do with a notion of the spiritual superiority of maleness. And in this way, the statement is reminiscent of a theological construct developed by Hildegard of Bingen, who declared, woman is to man as flesh is to spirit. As Carolyn Walker Bynum explains, women theologians in the latter Middle Ages saw woman as the symbol of humanity, where humanity was understood as physicality. Bynum's interpretation, however, does not suggest physicality as pejorative. As representatives of Christ's humanity, women reflected that part of God that was closer to mankind. However, the logical extension of the theological construct, as well as Mrs. Williams' statement, given the way they associate women with the flesh, implicates women's bodies as deterrent to spirituality and assigns a second-class spiritual status vis-a-vis men. Mary Daly put it this way: the fact that God the Son became man or male, assuming a human that is male body, enables males to become gods. Well, I mean to say something akin to that, but different. Men in their priestly roles are placed in a higher plane spiritually and allied questions about and focus on their bodies. Indeed, men attain a level of asexuality in their ministerial roles. The Catholic Church has for centuries predicated an all-male celibate priesthood on the idea of asexual male ministers or a male clergy beyond speculation about the body and sex. That is, as we know, is changing for reasons that have more to do with actual practice than tradition or theology. I won't go there. According to a Catholic tradition ratified by the Second Vatican Council, priests as princes of the church serve as representatives of God, including God's male gender and asexuality. They serve in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. Indeed, everything, including their physicality and maleness, priests are meant to represent alter Christus, another Christ. According to the medieval theological construct that the divine spirit is male and the flesh is female, only men are equipped to represent the divinity of God in their bodies. A male priest in his sacramental role is therefore considered beyond speculations about his body and sex. This claim remains the chief Catholic argument against women priests. Now, the Catholic Church reaffirmed this belief in 1977 in the Vatican Declaration, which essentially argued that women could not image Jesus in the priesthood. It further stated, the same natural resemblance is required for persons as for things. When Christ's role in the Eucharist is to be expressed sacramentally, there would not be this natural resemblance which must exist between Christ and his minister if the role of Christ were not taken by a man. In such a case, it would be difficult to see in the minister the image of Christ, for Christ himself was and remains a man. Now, a careful reading of this declaration, as well as all this thinking with regard to the inherent carnality or fleshiness of women, can be attributed to all women by this logic, and I think it does. But Mrs. Williams' statement, as well as the history of black women in the U.S., leads me to believe that it is especially applicable to black women. She certainly seemed to hold that there was something about her femaleness as a black woman that ill-equipped her to preach. So she had to develop a strategy which ultimately desexed or desexualized her. By becoming a man, Mrs. Williams was actually assuming a gender category that elided questions of sex and sexuality. Her last statement then is not an offhand comment about sex, where she says, "Now I believe that some people are born with a unity to God. These people are devoted to the work of the Lord. They don't have time to think about sex and the things of the world." Now, there were some inventive strategies black women developed during the migration to deal with this problem. Mrs. Williams' statement indicates that her approach to dealing with the perceived incompatibility of womanhood and its implied connection to carnality with ministerial leadership was to deny her body, herself, her femaleness. As she put it, when she came under the influence of the Holy Ghost, she was no longer a woman. Then and only then did she have the right to perform the duties of a man. By becoming a man in order to exercise an authority to preach the Christian gospel, Mrs. Williams had to embrace the spiritual superiority of maleness, and by doing so, place herself beyond speculation about her body and about sex. Now, this was a pretty radical approach to the problem that had some precedent in American religious history. Catherine Breckes, in her wonderful book, Strangers and Pilgrims, told the story of an 18th century white woman preacher named Jemima Wilkinson, who, in defense of her public preaching, declared that she had literally died and had been resurrected, and as such, she was no longer a she, but a genderless spirit sent by God. Now, although few black preaching women have been known to articulate claims about the Holy Spirit, about gender, and about the body in the same terms as Mrs. Williams, the attempt to desexualize themselves was fairly widespread among those who sought to defend their presence in the pulpit throughout the migration era. It was part of a complex strategy employed by by black preaching women who aim to detract attention from their bodies and sexuality by rendering themselves sexually ambiguous or by complicating the very notion of femaleness. They manipulated what Elaine Wallace terms a set of confused gender expectations, which required that they be maternal, nurturing, and pragmatic, rational. Right? Occupying both gendered realms, but fully ensconced in neither. Rejecting domesticity, these black women preachers indicated that they were mothers, but not wives. They and their parishioners understood wifehood to carry a bodily or sexual connotation that motherhood, ironically, did not. Through this strategy, they attempted to take control of their self-representation as women and as ministers. They sought to authenticate their religious power and authority, to reframe the gender discourse with regard to black women in ministry. Now, there are two examples. Mary G. Evans, picture, and Elder Lucy Smith, another picture. Mary G. Evans, very, very fascinating woman who died in 1963 in Chicago. Not long after she arrived in Chicago in 1932, the rumors started. She's a lesbian. She's a lesbian. She's a lesbian. The rumors started. In 1990, in conducting some research on this, one of my friends, this was repeated to one of my friends. And everyone she interviewed about Mary Evans, they mentioned that rumor. She's a lesbian. She was a lesbian. She was a lesbian. And her relationships and her personal demeanor to these congregants seemed to substantiate the rumors. She was involved in a relationship with a woman named Harriet Kelly, Indiana, wherein I found the 1930 census where she considers Harriet her sister. And of course, the record goes on to say that they were born in different places with different parents, but that's what she did. And she also shared a home for the rest of her life with a woman named Edna Cook. But Evans also dressed in an austere manner. She was known to wear a shiny black suit. She refused to change it because she was involved in some building projects, and she wanted to save all of her money and put it toward these building projects. She wore what was considered a severe hairstyle, and she wore no makeup. Lesbian. So therefore the rumors as far as some of these people were concerned. So she also had a style of leadership associated with the male clergy of the city. She was known to, quote, dot every I and cross every T. Now, the term mannish was attributed to her, a term much in common parlance in the 1930s urban culture. There's a quote in a song that forgive me, Amy and Janet, I won't sing it, but J.M. Gates, he has one of his most famous sermons is called Mannish Women. Mannish Women. And at the very end of that song, that sermon, he breaks out into song where he says this: there's some women in the church with their dresses too long. Take the hem out of the dress, let it fall, and let the church roll on. Mannish women. So he goes on in this sermon, he gives this depiction of what a mannish woman would be like, and mostly mannish women want to be like men. So when Mary Evans is considered mannish, it's very much in common parlance during the 1930s about these mannish women who seem to be such a threat to the culture. The accusation of mannishness was often directed toward black preaching women and was a crucial aspect of the discourse centering on the woman minister's body and sexuality. A wide range of 1930 sources characterized black preaching women as, quote, plain, buxom, plump and brown, and homely. They were said to have, quote, deep voices and masculine body features and masculine movements. Whether Mary Evans was a lesbian is so not the point. What is more to the point is the way she manipulated her public image to work within the, quote, confused gender expectations, and in so doing, attempt to deflect attention away from her body and questions about her sexuality. Although it is not likely that by living in a long-term relationship with another woman, Evans could entirely evade speculations about her sexuality, that was in fact, I think, what she was doing. And there was historical precedent for that as well. More to the point, Evans appropriated, even performed, motherliness and mannishness in order to meet the confused expectations. She was known to mother her congregation while at the same time known to be stern. So you see the expectations working there. But this motherliness was an attempt to also desexualize herself. And this is where I also got in trouble where I gave this paper, my beginning thoughts about this a couple of years ago with the women, because I suggest, and I hold true to this, I think I'm right, that the category of mother or church mother remains the most desexualized category in the black church tradition. The descriptions of mothers and church mothers suggest that these women are to occupy a space beyond physical concerns and even beyond biological reproduction. Drawing on West African models of women elders, mothers in some interpretations of the black church tradition are sagacious leaders of the young, particularly young women, and serve as mediators between the sexes. But the role of church mother is often not available to young women. It's presumably reserved for those, quote, most respected in the congregation, often widows and those past their sexual prime. Here again, the Catholic Church, for me, serves as a model. The Mother Mary is historically seen as a de-eroticized figure in Christian tradition. And when she has not been seen as de-eroticized, there has been trouble. Black leaders developed the image of this sexless, pure black mother in the early 20th century to counter images of the hyper-sexualized black woman. This non-sexual black mother was found also in African American literature. In Nella Larsen's novel, I believe it was Passing, Irene, the protagonist, her husband, declares at one point that sex with her had become a grand joke, and that she was the mother of his children, and that's all, right? Mary Evans wished to shape her own representation in such a way that did not raise speculation about her body or sexuality. She saw herself in that gender-neutral category of minister. Now, here is a woman who allowed herself to be photographed many times over her lifetime. Picture, picture, picture. Most of these photographs, and photographs are a text of one's life, she's often in profile, where it is not really clear what gender she wants us to think about, actually. It's very, very gender neutral, where the body is in de-emphasis, and even sometimes the facial features. And she's often mostly in clerical garb. And so I think what she's trying to do there is to put herself in that category where she is beyond speculations about the body. The one thing she's not trying to do is to suggest to you that she is a, quote, woman minister. Now, Elder Lucy Smith. Elder Lucy Smith was a pastor of a very different kind of church from Mary Evans. It was not too far from Evans's church, but Smith faced the same challenges. Her strategy, however, was a little different. She hid her husband from public view and developed a near exclusive, what I call, female sacred world, where men are marginal, if visible at all. I have some wonderful photographs from the 1940s where the Farm Security Administration came through on Easter Sundays, and incredible photographs where they're in the back of the church and take photographs of the congregation. They're up above and they're taking. And you see the men quite literally on the margins of the congregation. The women occupy the center and the forefront. The men are on the margins and in the back. I think that's deliberate. I think that's very, very deliberate. Both of the two versions of her unpublished biography state that Smith arrived in Chicago in 1910 alone, having been abandoned by her husband, William. "My husband left his family," she said, "and went to another city. I had to work and keep the children from starving and going naked." Although it made for compelling drama, the story of Lucy Smith's separation from her husband played out differently than the way she told it. He actually joined her a short while after she arrived in the couple, and the couple produced 2 additional children. I found this out from her granddaughter. He was instrumental in helping her build her church, All Nations Pentecostal, but the only surviving record that unequivocally identifies him as her husband is the obituary, which I also have. He is not referred to as her husband in the biography. Rather, he is obliquely mentioned as William Smith or Brother Smith. Now, why is this? There are many possible reasons, but I think primarily this is because the presence of a husband invited unwanted and troublesome speculation about her body and sexuality. Again, Margaret Alexander in James Baldwin's play is an example here. What really riles Alexander's congregation when Luke arrives is the very real possibility that Margaret could have a sexual life, that Margaret has a body. And they don't like this. She should be beyond nature or without much nature. Now, Smith did not face as much speculation about her sexuality as Evans did, presumably, but she had to face seemingly endless preoccupation with her physical stature. She was 6 feet tall and weighed over 300 pounds. So her body was very much at issue. All the scholarship on her, including mine, mentions this. Caton and Drake called her elderly, corpulent, dark-skinned, and maternal. Fenton Johnson, the great poet who worked for the WPA during the late 30s, simply called her a large, gray-haired black woman. Like Evans, Smith made use of the mother image and was known to mother her congregation. She was called Mother to the Drifting Black Masses, or simply Mother Smith. Importantly, however, Smith did not consider herself a wife. In fact, it's pretty clear she rejected most forms of domesticity. In one of the many comments she made in answer to an inquiry about her size, she said, "I used to be small, but since becoming a pastor, God took me out of the kitchen." She created a female sacred world. Her home was filled with women. Her church was filled with women. The predominance of women in the church prompted Herbert Smith, of no relation, was a student from the University of Chicago, to characterize the church as overwhelmingly feminine. Now, this characterization is both apt and ironic. Women held all the leadership positions in the church, and the congregation was about 90% female, which is high even for Pentecostal churches. The women of this church, like their pastor, subverted traditional gender expectations, where in their private lives, in their home lives, they may have been wives. But in their female sacred world, the world that Smith created, they were saints. Theirs was a self-contained black womanhood configured in relation to other women and defined without reference to men. Now, what to make of all of this? I can't wait to hear what my 2 respondents have to say. But here's what I'm concluding in all of this study. I argue that the prevailing perceptions about black women's bodies and their implied connection to sex and sexuality have been a key component in a culture of resistance to black women preachers. When I see the resistance to black women preachers, when I hear the resistance, I hear comments about the body. I hear an objection to the black woman's body being in ministerial leadership. Mrs. Williams, Mary Evans, and Elder Lucy Smith were three who developed inventive strategies that effectively subverted dominant notions and conventions of gender, even as they represented themselves as asexual and maternal. But I think this is a cautionary tale, though, because I think there's a persistent objectifying gaze that remains. And I was reminded of this when Bishop Vashti McKenzie, who is now the only AME bishop after their long history, she was ordained, where she said the stained glass ceiling has been broken. She wrote, though, what she called 10 womanist commandments, and one of them was, "Thou shalt not compromise your femininity for the sake of the ministry," which I thought was interesting, because that would suggest that's precisely what gets compromised, right? Several things I take away from this. Perhaps we should, dare I say, move away from notions of gender in the way they're conceived and think about being in the world, what one scholar has called the lived body, an existential phenomenology, as one faces the material facts of one's body and its relationship to a given environment. But if we have to think about gender, maybe we should confine its use to an analysis of social structures for the purposes of understanding certain specific relations of power. But I also think that what comes out of this for me too, though, if you want to think about it in positive terms, think about what this emphasis on black women's body can offer positively. I think about the incarnation. Maybe it brings our thoughts to the body, the wonder of the body, the sacredness of the body, or an embodiment. And if there is, for some, an inextricable connection between the black women's body and sexuality, perhaps we can think about, through this, the lesson for us is to think about the sanctity of sex and perhaps the sanctity of sexuality. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let the respondents speak, and perhaps through this and their response, we can raise some questions that I hope to answer for you. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Professor Best for a very, I think, important and fantastic article. I also want to I'm appreciative of the opportunity to speak here. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. At the outset of his article, Wallace Best uses Alvin N. Cannon's interview with the anonymous Mrs. Smith to make the point that associating women with the flesh implicates women's bodies as a deterrent to spirituality and assigns women to a second-class spiritual status vis-a-vis men. Thus, in order to do the work of the ministry, Miss Williams had to deny herself, her gender, and the flesh of the woman, and embrace the Holy Spirit and spirituality of maleness. She had to incorporate the power and the authority that comes with maleness into her female body. End quote. What I see Best doing here is drawing attention to a certain theological formulation which became expressed in culturally accepted conceptions of black women throughout the 19th and 20th century. The consequence of this widely held theological formulation, Best goes on to write, was that, quote, the dominant American culture did not recognize black women as embodying moral virtue or pure spirituality. Indeed, the ideology that had developed under slavery, black women did not qualify to the exalted status of natural womanhood. He goes on to write that by the late 19th and early 20th century, the stereotype of the lascivious, promiscuous, morally corrupt black woman had congealed within the white mind. End quote. So what we have here is a specific connection between male dominance and theological discourse, which results in rendering maleness natural and necessary, both theologically and socially. In my reading of Best, I see the bulk of his historical work carefully exposing the antagonism between the male as normative, both spiritually and socially, and the self-affirming black woman who reconfigures herself in opposition to these norms. The crux of Best's thesis appears to be black women, through strategic forms of resistance, destabilized contradictory gender expectations that held the asexual male as the social and theological ideal. At the same time, in my understanding of the struggles of Miss Williams, Mary Evans, Elder Lucy Smith, I think there's another interpretation to be made that builds upon the historical analysis that Best provides. There are elements to Best's critique of the black preacher which seems to be implied in this history. In the approach that I want to advocate, I'd like to make these elements more explicit. This second approach, which in the time that I have I will only be able to provide a preliminary sketch, deals more explicitly with what I see as a dualism that rests just behind the historical study that Best draws to our attention. By dualism, I mean to say that during the 19th and 20th century, it appears that there are in fact two conceptions of natural at play in the idea of the inherently immoral black woman and the virtuous Christian black male. This duality, when translated into the social realm, results in what Best has described as the cultural acceptance of the righteous male preacher and the cultural rejection of the inherently immoral black woman. These two different conceptions of natural allow for a certain theological loophole, in the sense that the Christian black male, though born from the amoral flesh of the black woman, somehow escapes the black woman's fate of being forever signified as inherently carnal and irredeemably immoral. If we work through the logic behind these two different conceptions of natural, we have on the one hand the black woman signified as being in a state of perpetually fallen nature. Her flesh, as Best describes, can only be seen in terms of a hypersexualized body. Her actions can only be interpreted as inherently promiscuous, irredeemably immoral. Yet the black community is nurtured and brought into being via the womb of the black woman. This means the amoral conception of the black woman is in fact a statement concerning the basic nature of all black bodies, black men included. Here is our first conception of natural. All black bodies share a fallen state of nature. On the other hand, we have a different conception of natural, which, as Best points out, legitimates the spiritual superiority of the black male over that of the black woman. The paradox of the second conception of natural is that although by birth the black male shares with the black woman an original fallen state, the black male inevitably has an alternative destiny. As Best writes, quote, women's embodiment is signified as defining their spiritual status, while men's bodily existence does not impugn negatively upon their spirituality, end quote. With the ability of the black male to ascend to a state of spiritual virtue, despite his original fallen state, we come to our second conception of natural, namely the natural ability of the black male to achieve spiritual superiority over the black woman. By drawing attention to what appears to be two hierarchical conceptions of natural circling within black church thought prior and during the migration era, one can draw a complementary set of conclusions to those made by Best concerning the meaning behind black women's resistance within the church. I certainly agree with Best that the practices of desexualization undertaken by black women seeking to defend their presence in the pulpit appears to be, as he puts it, quote, part of a complex strategy employed by black preaching women who aim to detract attention away from their bodies and sexuality by rendering themselves sexually ambiguous or complicating the very notion of femaleness, end quote. But as I am suggesting, there actually appears to be two conceptions of natural circling behind the historical narrative that Best has pointed out. In light of this, I see the self-negation undertaken by Miss Williams, Mary Evans, and Elder Lucy Smith, not a denial of their being women, but rather a denial of the underlying social cosmology that has signified them as permanently possessing an immoral physical nature. The theological loophole, black women equals a moral nature, but black male equals one who is spiritually superior, appears to lose its signifying power once the sexual identity of the black woman becomes ambiguous. In other words, it appears that the ambiguous sexuality of the black woman not only pierces through the myth of black men and black women having dual natures, this ambiguity also disrupts the exclusive claim of the black male to spiritual superiority. Because we are in a unique position to recast what could not have been seen in previous historical periods, I don't assume that these women during the migration era would have interpreted the stakes of their situation precisely in the terms that I've just tried to describe. At the same time, I do not think that my reading of Best's narrative stands in conflict with his own conclusion that these women emancipated themselves from a state of spiritual inferiority by detracting attention away from their bodies and sexuality. My position that they did this by undercutting the theological loophole that legitimated their inferiority is, at least as I see it, a continuation of Best's own thesis. Closing thoughts. In closing, I'd like to take a step back and say a few things about how I think Best's article really offers a significant challenge to what might be considered common sense approaches to African American Christianity. In fact, I see his article doing this in two ways. First, by giving attention to the social and theological discourse surrounding the sexual body of the black woman, Best exposes an internal power struggle among black church participants, which does not seem to surface in traditional accounts of African American religious history. Given what was and what continues to be at stake in black women's struggles for social and spiritual authority, I see Best suggesting that it is almost irresponsible to describe black church life as a homogeneous entity struggling only against external forces. Saidiya Hartman's work, Scenes of Subjugation, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in the 19th Century America, makes a very similar claim concerning problematic assumptions about the alleged homogeneity within black communal life. Hartman argues that contestations among blacks during the 19th century actually reveals a plurality of internal resistances which the homogeneous term community often silences. The point to take home here is that I think Best's historical study demonstrates that loose conceptions of black church life, or black communal life in general, belies the double sense of alienation that black women continue to struggle against. Secondly, I think Best's turn to sex and power within the black church also exposes the practices of exclusion that helped shape our heroic perception of the black male preacher. This deconstruction of the black male self is a healthy turn for the study of African American religion. Indeed, it cannot be understated that Best's historical study disrupts homogeneous conceptions of the black church precisely when he refuses to use the black male as a primary lens for constructing this history. Let us hope in future work to come, Best continues to pursue this very exciting path towards giving voice to the contestations and asymmetries within African American religious history. Thank you.
So I'm told that in my application to Harvard Divinity School, the admissions committee had quite a laugh when they saw my name. So your mistake is quite all right. It's happened a few times. And in fact, that might be a reason why I got in. But that being aside, I'm really honored to have been asked to come here and speak and to respond to someone whose work I greatly admire. And I want to just start with situating my response in the diversity of religious traditions that I've been studying here while I've been at HDS. I found a few passages from different religious texts that I think are interesting in light of Professor Best's comments. The first is from the Gospel of Thomas, which I've been studying with Professor Karen King in the Nag Hammadi Library. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. The second is from the Lotus Sutra, which I studied with Professor Gyatso a couple of years ago. And this is a text in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. I've edited it a little bit to make it shorter so it won't exactly resemble the original. But here it goes. At that time, Shariputra said to the dragon girl, "You suppose that in this short time you have been able to attain the unsurpassed way, i.e. to become a Buddha. But this is difficult to believe. Why? Because a woman's body is soiled and defiled, not a vessel for the law. She cannot become a Buddha." The girl said, "Watch me." At that time, the members of the assembly all saw the dragon girl change into a man and preach the law according to all the human and heavenly, preach the law to all the human and heavenly beings in the assembly. And this last one is from an essay on visionary traditions among Native American women of the Plains in the book Dreams, which I studied and which is edited by Professor Kimberly Patton. The visionary powers of dreams also gave a sanction for switching gender and identity roles among women and men. Women could have visions that allowed them to participate fully in male-dominant activities. Among the Blackfeet, this resulted in a special social category called the manly-hearted woman, who might, as a result of dreams or visions, live a life modeled on male behavior. In my studies, I've also encountered themes such as these in African traditions and in Australian Aboriginal traditions. Now, I'm not attempting to say that these traditions are analogous to one another, for surely they are not, but rather to suggest that issues around women's social and ecclesiastical leadership roles appear in a diverse array of religious contexts, and that throughout history, women have been using many of the same strategies to subvert, reframe, and reinvent restrictive gender categories. These examples echo the way in which the women in Professor Best's essay employ approaches like prophetic vision, gender transformation, divine intervention, sexual renunciation, and affiliation with female biblical figures to claim ecclesiastical authority. The inventiveness of Best's female pastors lies in how they apply these strategies to the unique situation of African American women. Now, I'd like to highlight two features of this unique situation and how they influence women's roles in the African American church. The first is what I would call an eschatology of black male-female relationships. This eschatology is rooted in the experience of familial separation and physical terror that characterized slavery and post-slavery America. Because slave women were routinely raped and separated from their husbands and children, and because slave men were often powerless to intervene, our culture casts stable love relationships as attainable only in the heavenly afterlife. This eschatological conception has been upheld throughout American history as slavery's violent persecution has evolved to political and economic disenfranchisement, racial profiling, police brutality. For example, the recent case of 23-year-old Sean Bell in New York City, who was gunned down by police officers the night before his wedding. Because black relationships often fail to survive in this highly tenuous atmosphere, the idealized eschatological partner becomes the focus. In the case of African American women, I suggest that this partner is Jesus, and that the adoption of a pious, desexualized, and virginal Christian identity is the means of earning heavenly reward of a stable and nurturing divine relationship. Now, this little theory that I'm kind of working with explains two important features of black female church involvement highlighted by Professor Best. The black woman church leader / virginal mother, who, in the words of Best Pastor Williams, doesn't, quote, have time to think about sex and things of this world. Perhaps she makes this statement because she has set her sights on a more reliable, stable, eschatological relationship with Jesus. The second feature of black female church involvement, explained by my theory, is the church-going woman who is a loyal adherent to the male pastor, the most powerful signifier of Christ's presence in the church. Ironically, it is often such women who are as opposed to female ecclesiastical leadership as men are, if not more so. The second aspect of the unique situation of African American women in the Christian church, which I want to highlight, also stems from this issue of physical terror in slavery and post-slavery America. As Bess has noted, even after emancipation, quote, black women remain vulnerable to sexual violation by white men, and, quote, their bodies have long been contested terrain. This is consistent with the way women's bodies in anthropological terms are seen as repositories of national identity, a concept frequently used to explain the universal occurrence of rape as a tool of conquest. In this case, the bodies of black women are, as Bess notes, quote, a highly charged site of freedom and identity, and I would add to that resistance. To justify their efforts to violate black women's freedom, I propose that the dominant white Christian culture cast the black woman as Eve. According to Best, she is seen as, quote, lascivious, promiscuous, and morally corrupt. And in some cases, black men who are powerless to save her from this fate may assuage their guilt and outrage by blaming the victim. They join white men in these situations in casting the black women as hypersexualized and partially to blame for the fall of the race. In contrast, the white woman is cast as the Virgin Mary, protected and placed on a pedestal as the ideal, inviolable woman. Best suggests that white women alone are seen as the, quote, pious embodiment of religious and moral virtue. I argue that this identity, defined as it is by the Christian narrative, becomes a strategic tool in the black woman's revisionist project of, quote, righting the body, a concept that Best borrows from French feminism. Best says that black women's efforts to defend their sexual respectability has been central to their religious activities. I would press that point further to say that constructing a new identity based upon the religious narrative of Mary, mother of Jesus, is the means by which black women distance themselves from Eve and thereby protect themselves from physical violation by both black and white men. This newly constructed identity is necessarily complex. Yes, it is the Virgin Mother who has conceived without sex. But to this symbolic foundation is added the identities of masculinized mother and surrogate mother to bolster the protective trope and ensure bodily safety from sexual terror. Best notes that black men such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Alexander Crummell participate in this process of cultural revision, putting forth the image of the idealized black woman. She is a moral mother who is supposed to uplift the race. However, according to Best, she also has the responsibility for dismantling her perceived hypersexuality. The combination of these two agendas turns her into a sexless construct. Indeed, Best says, motherly becomes equated with sexless in some African American contexts. It is a small step from sexless to manly. The, quote, plain, plump, homely, buxom woman with an unusually deep voice, quote, deflects attention away from her body as well as her sexuality. As a result, she is unlikely to become a target of sexual violation, especially when positioned as a religious leader and a faithful Christian mother. As the surrogate, quote, mother of the drifting masses, as in the case of Pastor Lucy Smith, Migration-era women formed rooming houses to both provide for themselves and support lodgers arriving in the North. Being a surrogate mother to an ongoing stream of women and men created physical safety for the black women by enmeshing her in a web of adult relations who were as loyal to her as a child is to its mother. But this role also alleviated her from the need for a father to those adult children or a male partner in such an enterprise, thereby ensuring that she could remain both virginal and, as the sole head of the household, she could also remain manly. So in conclusion, the black woman, in accepting the male spirit of the Holy Ghost, as best Pastor Williams terms it, accomplishes two objectives in the struggle for bodily freedom and identity. First, she ensures her eschatological reward. She will be reunited in heaven with Jesus, a safer, more stable, and reliable partner than the perpetually persecuted and persecuting black man of this world. Secondly, her Eve-like femininity is sexually neutralized by this male spirit, and she is reinvented as Mary, virginal mother and surrogate mother to the suffering masses. But this receipt of the male spirit is taken even further as she becomes the divinely masculine preacher. In rewriting her body as saved for and transformed by the masculine spirit, she guards her bodily safety in the earthly realm and ensures her reward in heaven. Thank you.
Thank you so much, the both of you, Terence and Lauren. I appreciated those comments so much. You come to a night like tonight, and to hear our students speak in this way, it's thrilling, quite frankly. And I thank you so much for reading so carefully the article and quite frankly, getting it. You went right there to some of the things. And I won't take up much time in response because I think I want to hear more voices. But just a couple of things. Lauren, thank you for pointing out these examples in other literatures and other traditions that I was unaware of. I knew that this idea was pervasive, but come on, that's really quite striking. The way in which you suggest that Jesus and black women's eschatological hopes play into this is a very important thing to be reminded of, actually, and something I didn't bring out to the degree that I could have in the article. But something you also suggest, too, there's a lot of subversion and reframing bodily freedom you see in this with these women that I want to thank you for pointing that out, and also this the degree to which this is a way, a reach for a level of purity that is unavailable to black women in their bodies, reimagining themselves as the Mary, as you put it. I really like that, and this whole notion of the black woman as Eve. Perhaps that's a starting point if we see the black woman as Eve. Terence, I want to mention, you mentioned several things as well that really deserve a lot more attention. One of the things you mentioned, that this is a basic statement about all black bodies. That is absolutely right. The extension of this is a commentary about the black body, which historically has been up for debate and discussion. But you also pointed out something we've talked about before, that this is actually my daring to talk about internal struggles within black churches. We think of, get rid of the idea of the black church. No such thing exists. There are multiple perspectives. And what I'm trying to show in my work, this work and other work, behind all of that is some diversity of opinions and of views, and so I appreciate your thoughts on that as well. So I'll stop talking and get some questions from you and do my best to answer. So, yes, Carol.
Thanks for a really great paper.
Thank you.
Thank you to Respondent, Terence Keel, for your excellent comments
Okay. Okay.
I don't want to monopolize the discussion here. Okay, so how did these women, do you have any sense from the historical record how these women dealt with, because black male bodies are eroticized as well.
Yes,
so
yes.
how did they deal with that?
Yes.
And the erotics of black male preaching. Do they just absorb, they just choose one side of a black male preaching persona, which is the power to be and the legitimacy to be in the pulpit, but not necessarily the erotics of preaching in terms of the black male preacher in relationship to...
Yeah. Well, that quite an important question as well. I mean, because you can get from this, and I stated in the chapter that the likes of Michael Eric Dyson and all, they do talk about the erotics of preaching and how black preaching has been eroticized. But what I'm meaning to suggest by that is that the black male preacher, in a sense here, gets a pass. In a sense, he does. He gets a pass, whereas we normalize the movements of his body. For instance, they didn't ask Sam Cooke to don a robe when he was shifting and shaking, doing the very same work that Mahalia Jackson was. She had to wear a robe, but Sam Cooke becomes the first gospel sex symbol. And he celebrated for it. So I think there's a double standard there in the way in which the bodies are read differently. There's an understanding of the erotics of preaching, but when it comes to women, there's the policing takes over, and also there's the inscription overlaid. If I hear your question correctly, I think you want to know if these women understand that these men are sexualized as well. I think they do, but I think they also understand that their bodies are read differently, and that the erotics of preaching are applied sort of in unequal terms to them. And in fact, I never came across in my research, I've never come across a complaint from a woman about this necessarily. I mean, it's normalized that this is what black men do, and it's read different. So you do have a tradition of the wayward male minister, even again in novels. You can see where my work is going. I'm always mentioning something from a novel, but from African American religious tradition, Pleasant Green, and the Reverend Pleasant Green is sort of seen as this, the wayward preacher. Paul Robeson in Body and Soul plays the wayward preacher. But they get a pass in some ways, and the history is read differently, and their bodies are read differently in this regard. Yes, Amy?
I'm wondering if, there's the wayward preacher tradition, but I'm also wondering if, the things that Terence and Lauren said about nature, and also about the eschatological, I think are just absolutely, so right.
Mm-hmm.
And the eschatological, I work on medieval Christian European stuff, and that's just so perfect for some of the stuff I've been thinking about. So thank you for putting that out. And one of the things I'm wondering is whether that eschatological possibility that women, black women preachers, and church women, I presume, are always having to see as only available in some future state, for male preachers is a realized eschatology, that when they're joined with the Spirit, they're able to have a kind of religious, erotic life in relationship to the congregation that women aren't allowed to have because of the denigration of black female sexuality that they did in outside.
Well, and that's important because these women seem to be looking for a moment to be out of the body necessarily. I mean, it's to in the way that they want to transcend gender or be in a genderless category is a way to suggest too. I want to be out of the body. It's the body that restricts me and defines me, and I don't own it historically. I don't own it actually in some instances. So to be out of the body. And so this is where this point about Jesus being the hope, my eschatology is my freedom in a sense. And whereas you're right, Amy, whereas men sort of can, which is not to say they don't have an eschatological hope, but it can be realized in a quite different way. Yeah, you're exactly right. Yes. Janet.
Maybe also to read a little bit against the grain. Going back to the example of having to wear the robe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially with Tanya Jackson say, for example, I mean, one of the things is that the robe sort of covers up
Yes.
the sexuality, but you also can read it. I don't know. That's where I like to see the pictures and also the performance and all that.
Right.
It could be that the robe allows you to do stuff under the robe, like it actually makes possible something.
Well, I mean, but she
She can perform something.
Well, but that that it might. So maybe my larger question is: is it necessarily the case that the body is always being sort of set behind by some of these women? Is it the case that they're giving up their status as women? I'm sure that's the most complicated question.
in donning the
Well, or anything that they're doing. So, is their move always outside of their female gender? And I thought that that's what I heard, especially Terence asking. Is there not ways in which it's maybe more, convoluted, but nonetheless they're able to sort of sustain their female status? Certainly in the last person, Lucy Smith.
No,
there's a striking thing where there's a whole bunch of women are at the center, and one wonders what constitutes being women.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, because I think with Lucy Smith, what I say in the chapter is that she's actually trying to reconfigure femaleness in a sense. And so she's, in a sense, she has a different strategy there in a way where she actually renders men marginal and silent and sort of undergird this female sacred world, and in doing that, though, you quiet the questions about the body in that regard by your constituency. But that female sacred world also is tremendously empowering. And what it does is these women throw their attention on the wonder of their femalehood. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's happening in that context as well. They're taking great they take great joy in this company. I mean, and in my discussion and in my reading of that through the documents, the women are, I mean, in very, very creative ways, are very, very aware that they're creating this female sacred world too. And they know what they're doing, and they know the implications of what they're doing. And so, yes, it's not a running from, but it is, I think, a reinvention of what it means to actually have this world. They're as women, and they're reinventing what that actually means for them. Yes. Matthew.
When you were talking about the migration era preachers desexualizing themselves as addressing the problems of female sexuality in the ministry, I couldn't help but think of like the abolitionist women preachers who would have that same challenge to them while they were preaching in front of men.
Yes.
But women like Maria Stewart and Sojourner Truth who used the opposite, maybe an opposite tactic by baring their breasts to prove that they were women and prove their sexuality. So do you see those in some senses juxtapose challenges to that paradigm of femaleness and maleness in black ministry? Or do you see them as juxtaposed? Or see them
What you're suggesting, of course, is that scene where Sojourner Truth's femaleness was called into question, so she bears her breasts. Aren't I a woman? The context there of the 19th century is that black women are outside of a notion of pure womanhood itself, and so her task is to prove that she actually is a woman, and in doing that, she's doing a number of things. She's owning her body, legitimizing herself, her humanity, and also putting herself in a trajectory of true womanhood, which was precisely at stake. And so I talk about the difference between the 19th century and the 20th century projects. And so what you're suggesting is a very different. These women had to, quite frankly, prove. But any woman operating in the 19th century in a public way, it was her essence as female that was precisely called into question, and that's what. I don't know if that gets to the question, but it's a different cultural project. But that's what was called into question: her femaleness and, by extension, her humanity. And so, in bearing her breasts, she's saying, "I'm human too, as well." Yeah. I think we have a question back here, and we'll come over here at the Tim. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
A second breath, and so there's a new spirit which is male. I am reminded of spirit possession, and a lot of the African religion, the mythology, the rituals that we have been studying with Professor Olufona this semester points to this act of recreation and the notion that the orishas or the deities, the divine, is always creating and in tandem with humans, and so that this notion of being able to say, I, with divine powers, can in fact transform myself and be given this agency. And I'm reminded of the women in Santeria and Espiritismo who are in fact, not just for a moment, not just for a ritual, infused and embodying this power, which they call male, but in fact allows them to penetrate certain circles that are forbidden to menstruating women, or who are only able to be populated by women who stop menstruating. And so that there are all these codes that women are breaking through spirit possession.
I think that's a wonderful connection to in the sense that and one way to think of that it is the spirit. The common theme here is the spirit, and the spirit that gives liberty in this regard to break into new areas. Mrs. Williams, it's interesting what happens to Mrs. Williams. She understands what happens in herself. Her essence is being changed in a way, and what she's doing. She's a Pentecostal, and that's not inconsequential. It is the spirit that gives us enabling power. I think the difference between the orishas and this kind of embodiment that I'm talking about too is in the sense that it gives, in the orisha tradition, the Yoruba tradition, it's not giving sort of a primacy to maleness or to femaleness in a hierarchical sense, whereas that's in this way, this is precisely what's happening to her. I mean, she's giving a primacy to the maleness of the Holy Spirit, where in the orisha tradition, I mean, that's not the point. I mean, you have people who could be possessed by a female orisha, a male possessed by a female orisha, and a female possessed by a male orisha, and that is a liberty to move within sort of gendered spaces. Whereas the difference here, though, is the primacy that's given to the superiority of maleness, which you would not have in Santeria or Candomblé. Yeah. Tim has a question.
This is out of curiosity. It's kind of related to the issue of possession. In your work and in your study, it's the question about how is the devil portrayed?
How the devil is portrayed?
Gender-wise. Is the devil a man? Is it also a male gender? And if it is, and yet it becomes this issue of possession, and women and their bodies are seen as lascivious and tools of this male devil, and if they are possessed by this male devil, then how is it that this connection has been made to have? Yeah, you do. I'm saying this kind of crudely, but how is the devil personified?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I don't think. There is a whole history of there. Even now, there's a new biography of Satan, which I perhaps should have read for your question, but I don't know that history. Well, the one thing I do know that Satan, Lucifer, has been gendered as male. What that means, though, in terms of possession by an evil spirit, I don't know if anyone knows that. If the gendered aspects of that have any bearing at all. For instance, what I hear in your question, I think I hear in your question, is if someone's possessed by the devil or possessed, does it matter that they're possessed by a male spirit or the manifestations of that? The manifestations are particularly red male.
It's basically what it is that is this issue of female body, male spirit.
Yes.
Okay. How that's kind of taboo. That they need to kind of suppress the female body. But when it comes to issues of women and their bodies and how they're seen as lustful are used as basically tools of the devil. And yet the devil is seen not necessarily as a not sex with it, but I still kind of is the devil personified as a male spirit as well, or do you understand how there's this?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm really getting it. I mean, I think I probably am overthinking your question to some degree, but because the answer that comes to me, Amy, did you have what? Because it seems to me the answer is yes, but I think you want me to draw a parallel between the devil possessing bodies and the Holy Spirit possessing bodies, and I don't quite know if I know where you're going with that. We can talk about it. Amy, do you have a way to?
Just one thing that may be relevant from, and again, I don't know in the folks you're talking about, but in sort of medieval traditions, one who has power is male. So the devil's male, God's male, Holy Spirit's male, right? And the one who is susceptible to being overtaken by that power is female. So women occupy this very untenable situation where they're subject to possession, and then men on earth have to decide: are you possessed by God, or are you possessed by the devil? Right? So the possessing is always in the Christian is always figured as male, and the possessed almost always, even if it's a man, figured as female.
But it is an interesting contrast, because in one case the woman's body is not appropriate for being possessed by the male spirit. Right. But what you're trying to say is that in this case the female body is possessed.
Yeah. No, that's interesting.
Spirit, and then I could maybe push it further. In some kind of Tibetan cases, that is actually a female power. That's a good thing. That there's something about the body, the female body that in fact allows for better access.
The penetrability of the female body is itself what is the source of power for women, right? Because they have that penetrability that makes them the more apt site for the divine to appear, but it's dangerous because it's also the more apt site for the devil to appear.
So that's kind of the connection I was saying.
Oh. Yeah, that's and that's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things I hope with this, my modest attempt here to uncover this history is to rethink of maybe sort of address this history and perhaps develop some new thinking about black women's bodies and their black women's bodies in our culture, and how these bodies are read. If we can begin to change our mind and change our historical conceptions, perhaps there are avenues of understanding that open up of the potential of the female body, and to subvert some of that history. And this is, I think, Lauren, this is what you were getting at, to subvert some of that history and overturn some of that bad history and think in more positive lights. Because I'm serious when I say that I think this perhaps gets us to think about the incarnation, to think about bodiliness or embodiment in much more substantive ways. If black women's bodies are evocative in some ways, can it be evocative of the sanctity of the body and embodiment and of sexuality? And we can think about and take Mrs. Williams' statement. Perhaps she is saying this power that she receives is a power that are available to women. Perhaps to be taken by the Spirit and to brought into new realms of power this way. And so it's an attempt, in a way, my own modest attempt to address the history and perhaps lead us to think in different ways about the potential of black women's body. I don't know how much time we have left, but maybe one or two questions. Yes.
Was there some, for the men who were clearly connected to these women, and I couldn't keep track of whose husband really left and whose husband
Okay. Yeah.
Was there some type of stigma that was passed on to them? How were these men seen, either by other women in the community or other men? What did it mean for them to be connected to these manly women or whatever?
Yeah, well, Elder Lucy Smith's husband their granddaughter, Little Lucy, as she's called, she's in her late 70s. She was a great gospel singer in her own right. I think she was perhaps a little embarrassed to give away the family secret that there was a very troubled relationship between Elder Lucy and William Smith, and she thinks it's because he wasn't a Christian, and she didn't want, in a sense, and she had this great work, and he never converted to Christianity. He helped around the church and so forth and so on, tore down walls, set up chairs, but he never really. And as the granddaughter said, well, my granddaddy, and so that was a way of saying, he was a man of the world, and so that might be some way, one explanation why Elder Lucy Smith did not, call him out as her husband. But I also think too that it was her story, not his. And there was a lot of that going on. These men in her church, in this female sacred world, were quite literally marginal to what went on. I mean, they might as well have just went home, quite frankly. They were not a part of this world. And I think, and the ones that were selected to be a part of it, and that was a place of honor in this female sacred world. To get to your question, I really think they understood themselves to be marginal, and they knew what they were getting into. When they came to Elder Lucy Smith's church to become a part of it, I think they understood that they were joining a female sacred world. What would be interesting is to discover what that meant for them, and I really don't know. We don't have, the very fact that we don't have much testimony from these men says a lot about the extent to which this is a woman's world. It's an interesting thought to think about what their experiences were like. But I say they were silent, and I mean that, because they did not speak much about this at all. I mean, this was a female sacred world run by women, where men's perspectives do not figure much. And mind you, that's actually, to the extent that it's happening at Smith's church, that's quite unusual, really, because what you have in some Pentecostal congregations, you'll have 70% church women in the church, and the leadership is still all male for some incredible reason, and that kind of thing. And so the women are there, but the perspectives are male. So you have that. They overturned that, which is why I'm saying they really, really were constructing something different, very conscientiously so. Maybe that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your questions, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.